Early in the month of April 1981, a telephone located at the police dispatch center in Chicago, Illinois, began to ring. When a dispatcher answered it, the frantic voice of an elderly woman met her ear from the other end. After what seemed like several minutes, the dispatcher was able to calm her down enough to understand where to send the police and to obtain a basic idea of what had happened. It seemed that a break-in had occurred, but that it was no longer in progress. The rest of it seemed to be incoherent. 2 police officers were sent to the home to take a statement and to do a welfare check. The call had been placed by a woman whose name was Sigrid Barganod. When police arrived, they found Sigrid in quite an anxious state. Who wouldn't be? Her home had been broken into after all. But it was more than that. She had a black eye and wounds on her face. It took them some time to calm Sigrid down enough that she could tell them what had happened. When she was ready, she told her story. Earlier that day, she had sat down on the couch and was overcome with drowsiness. Her eyes had closed on her living room, and she had dozed off. At some point, she heard a sound in the room, and her eyes snapped open in response. What she saw sent a shiver through her. She told police that when she had awakened, she saw shadowy figures moving around in her apartment, going here and there, seemingly oblivious to her. Sigrid screamed. This was when the figures took notice of her. According to Sigrid, they immediately covered her with a sheet and hit her repeatedly in the head before shoving her into the closet and closing the door. Sigrid was terrified and stayed put in the closet while the intruders rummaged through her home for valuables, or so she assumed. After a bit of time, the noises of the people in her apartment faded. She hadn't heard anyone leave per se, but she slowly, cautiously exited. They did seem to be gone. Her apartment was silent and still as if nothing had ever happened. From here, she went to her neighbor's house to call the police. She claimed that her own phone had been tampered with and nobody could hear her when she made a call. The police were skeptical of her story from the beginning. They didn't think she was a liar, but they did seem to assign some sort of senility to this octogenarian. It was difficult to believe that a break-in had occurred when nothing had been taken and there was no sign of forced entry anywhere in her home. Nothing had been tampered with. How had they gotten in? Whoever they were. And dark, shadowy figures? Well, that speaks for itself. They thought it was more likely that Sigrid had had a dream and then run into a wall upon waking, blending the 2 stories together in her mind. Sigrid realized that she was losing the officers on this, so she pulled out the sheet she had been wrapped in. It had blood on it. But this didn't sway the officers either. How would they know why there was blood there? Nothing else seemed to corroborate her story. Sigrid was treated for her wounds, and as a gesture to her, the police took the phone to be examined, since she had made the strange claim that it had been tampered with and her house had been bugged. But this, oddly enough, is the point where her story gets a little more believable. You see, the phone had been tampered with. In fact, the components of the voice transmitter had been ripped out by force. But by who? What did this mean? Who could have done this? Who would have done this? And when would this have happened? According to Sigrid, the phone had been malfunctioning for some time before this event took place. If they were worried about Sigrid calling the police, Why not rip out the transmitter components when they came in? Why do it quite a while before the event? Surely Sigrid didn't have the strength to pull this off, or the desire to do so even if she did. What did all of this mean? What was so important about an elderly woman living alone in Chicago? These questions only furthered the skepticism of her story. The police got her a new phone and tightened the screw in the voice receiver so that they couldn't get it off before returning it to her. They were still skeptical, but they did at least partially believe her at this point. The following week, she called the police again to complain that someone had broken into her apartment and tampered with her phone, once again, though a robbery had not occurred. Police showed up to her home and found that the phone had once again been tampered with. The components had, once again, been removed. They got her a new phone again. They tightened the screw the same as before, but this time they used the strongest glue they could find to tighten it and to make sure it wasn't coming off this time. After that, someone ripped the receiver and the cord out of the phone altogether. In May, she called the police to report another break-in. At a loss, the police began to patrol her street and to do surveillance on her home in regular intervals. The neighbors, privy to what was going on, trimmed their hedges to give them a better view. A social worker visited Sigrid during this time and made the suggestion that she move. However, she felt that she was unable to do so. On June 18th, as Sigrid returned from the bank, a man who had been hiding on her lawn mugged her. They fought in the lawn for some time, but Sigrid was somehow able to hold on to her purse and called the police from her neighbor's house after the event. The police took a report, but that was all they could do. Even with them patrolling the street at regular intervals, they had missed this person. After this, Sigrid started to break down. It became too much to deal with, never knowing whether or not she was safe in her own home. She tried to carry on like normal, as if none of this were happening, but in the middle of her conversations, she would just break down. Her demeanor changed into one of paranoia, simply waiting for these people to show up again. At one point, a neighbor recalls her saying, "They're going to kill me, I just know it." Who were these people? How were they getting in? She and the police had the same questions. On June 26th, a friend of Sigrid's stopped by her home to check on her. She had been in emotional distress after all. But there was no answer at the door. After trying a few more times, he called the police for a welfare check. That was when her body was found. Sigrid's statement, unfortunately, had been correct. She had been found face down and her hands had been tied with a tan scarf. The police blocked off the scene and the coroner removed the body from the home. 4 days later, a ruling would be made in this case. Sigrid had died of natural causes. Natural causes, you may ask. What about being discovered with your hands tied indicates to the coroner that she had died of natural causes? Sigrid's sister Ingvild had the same questions, but the Chicago police were entirely unconcerned with them. They continued to be very insistent that they had made the correct call. Their insistence was that it was possible for her to tie her own hands and then have a heart attack. Ingvild vehemently disagreed. She became involved in a legal battle with the Chicago Police Department, who refused to release the records to the family. Her claim was that Sigrid's daughter had gone to the home on September 30th to sort out her belongings and found evidence that it was not, in fact, natural causes that had killed her. Her bed and headboard were saturated with blood. Photographs had been taken, but they, perhaps unsurprisingly at this point, were not enough to sway the Chicago police. They did, however, sway the judge in her case, who ordered the Chicago Police Department to release the records of the case to the family. After this was accomplished, the family took them to a private investigator. They no longer trusted the police after their refusal to treat Sigrid's case with any kind of seriousness and what seemed to be a cover-up after her death. 42 years after a private investigator was hired, however, there are no answers. It seems obvious, however, that the ruling of natural causes was absurdly fallacious on the face of it. Nobody believes that Sigrid somehow tied her own hands, turned onto her stomach, and simply died of natural causes, leaving behind evidence of a murder just because. How does that work? All of the evidence points to her having been beaten by someone. But why would the police consistently ignore all of the evidence for months on end and then come to this wildly absurd conclusion? It does seem obvious that there was something to hide here. Was it a relative of one of the police officers committing these crimes? It is clear that something was known, something they didn't want out. The reluctance to release the records on a closed case concerning a death by natural causes strongly hints at that. Whether or not things were removed from that file prior to its release, we don't know. But we do know that the answers are out there, somewhere.